listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Jeff Farbman from the Wallace Center at Winrock International. Welcome to this webinar, the fourth and penultimate in a series of webinar trainings for farmer support organizations who work with small-scale farmers. This series is a partnership between the Agriculture and Land-Based Training Center, ALBA, and the National Good Food Network, and is funded by a grant from Western SARE. This third webinar, which is developing a quality management system, will be presented by Phil Britton of the Michigan Group Gap Network. As you hear, Phil has a broad perspective on quality management systems and has been a real innovator in using quality management systems in the agricultural food safety realm. In the question and answer section, we'll also be joined by Lindsey Gilmore of Organic Planet. The webinar series has been designed by the Agriculture and Land-Based Training Center, ALBA, in Salinas, California, a wonderful organization centered on growing organic farmers. They were one of a small handful of innovators who led on the very first Group Gap certified set of farmers. You will see how quality management systems and Group Gap are related, although anyway. The webinar is funded by Western SARE, as I mentioned, and is part of ALBA's project to bring the most current and usable food safety knowledge to supporters of small farms. The Wallace Center, who's the co-host of this webinar, is a business unit of Winrock International. The Wallace Center has been a leading organization in the movement for a more sustainable and equitable food system for over 30 years. Today, the center supports entrepreneurs and communities as they build a new 21st century food system that is healthier for people, the environment, and the communities. The center serves the growing community of civic, business, and philanthropic organizations involved in building a new good food system in the United States. In particular, we're focused on advancing regional collaborative efforts around the country to move good food, healthy, green, fair, affordable food beyond the direct marketing realm into larger scale wholesale channels. The National Good Food Network, or NGFN, is an initiative of the Wallace Center, structured as a network of networks which ensures efficient flow of information and innovation from boots-on-the-ground projects to the national level and back down to the grassroots level across the nation. And the Wallace Center coordinates and supports the network. Our goals are to work with the growers to ensure that there's an abundant supply of good food to meet the high consumer demand for the product, to collect and disseminate the best models, stories, methods, and outcomes, and to ensure that policymakers are informed about the wonderful successes our network and partners have had so that we can continue to increase support for regional healthy food. You can learn more about the great work the National Good Food Network does on our website, ngfn.org. And let me just give you a quick technical orientation. Your webinar screen looks something like this, with the presentation over on the left and the control panel on the right. If you don't see the control panel, it's probably been collapsed on the far right side of your screen. If you click the orange arrow button, it will expand. And if you go into the view menu and deselect auto hide the control panel, it will stay up and won't collapse. If you're going to want to do that because this is where you will communicate with us and ask your questions. In the questions, in the control panel, there's a questions box, and you'll see that you can type in your question there. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on ngfn.org/webinars within a few business days. And finally, right after the webinar, there's a quick post-webinar survey. If you would take a minute to fill that out, we would be grateful, and that's how we can report to our funders about the impact that we are having. So let me introduce Phil. He's going to take you through on quite an adventure today. Phil Britton is the director of the Michigan Group Gap Network, a statewide Group Gap certification effort. Phil has helped develop 3 separate Group Gap initiatives in Michigan, 2 of which were during the USDA pilot phase of the project. Late in 2014, Phil was hired by Cherry Capital Foods, a food hub based in Traverse City, and developed a separate group in Western Michigan that achieved certification in 2015. This group expanded statewide and achieved certification in 2016 through partnerships with several regional food hubs. In addition to group GAP work, Phil also works with a team of individuals coordinating on-farm food safety efforts throughout Michigan. He also had several years as a quality management systems engineer, I guess is what you'd call it, in the medical devices industry. He currently lives in Marquette, Michigan with his wife and 3 children. Okay, Phil.
Alrighty. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone, for hopping on this afternoon. I hope it's going to be an adventure. So today I want to talk a little bit on developing a QMS, and this is the ground we're going to cover. So I'll talk a little bit about me. It's always nice to know a little bit about who's talking to you, especially when you can't see them over a webinar. And then we're going to talk about QMS, what? Because it can be a bit of a dizzying topic at times. So I'm going to try to dispel the illusion and the smoke and mirrors on what a QMS is and what it does. We'll get into a little bit deeper dive into some of the components, and then talk through some hypothetical implementation scenarios, take a quick look at a QMS in action, and then have some time at the end for some questions and answers. So about me, Jeff already, I think, said all of these things, but I spent, prior to my work in food systems, I worked for about 6 years in medical device manufacturing, specifically in quality systems, overseeing tasks like document control, labeling, internal audits, and a few other things too. And then after that, I spent the last 3 years working in group GAP development and implementation. And the reason I mentioned that is because with group GAP, I don't know if any of you were on the webinar last time, a quality management system is kind of the central piece of it. So I'm not going to get into specifically what group GAP does in this presentation, but that's kind of the tie-in. And then, like Jeff also mentioned, I'm from Marquette on the shores of beautiful Lake Superior in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, so I am a Youper. And I also enjoy disc golf and chasing my 3 kids around. So what is a quality management system? And what is some of the history behind it? So I'm not super well versed in the origin story of quality management systems, but I do know that it has its roots in the Industrial Revolution and mass production. So the way goods used to be made was that you'd have a person in your community who would make whatever it is that you needed from start to finish, usually, and then as the Industrial Revolution happened and things started to become more mass-produced, it shifted from having one person make something from start to finish and then tweaking it along the way to meet their customer requirements to trying to make a lot of things that meet the same set of requirements with a lot more hands and different hands throughout the process. So quality management systems were developed to consistently meet customer requirements as goods were being made at scale. So it was a way to kind of bring everything into a more standardized fashion. It eventually solidified into different standards or methods, with the ISO 9000 series being the most widely adopted by far. In this webinar, I'll riff on the ISO 9001-2008 standard. There is a more recent revision, but I'm just more familiar with the 2008 version, and this isn't meant to be just the ISO specific one. The principles are pretty easily translatable between standards. This is more just an overview and how a quality management system ticks. And then now applications are spreading beyond manufacturing, just making things into farming and healthcare and law enforcement, community development, food safety, all different kinds of different applications of these principles. And so quality management systems provide a technology for identifying the requirements of customers and key stakeholders. Sometimes you'll also hear interested parties, that's another word. Basically anybody who's asking you or giving you requirements for you to either make something for them or provide something to them. So identifying those requirements and measuring how well they're being met and continuously improving on them. So we'll get into some of these pieces in more detail. I'm going to get into some definitions to kind of help lay that foundation before we get into more of the nuts and bolts of how a quality management system works. So when we talk about quality, what do we mean? You know, usually when we think of quality, we think of like how nice something is or the degree of craftsmanship. But for this purpose, the definition of quality is the degree to which a set of inherent characteristics fulfills requirements. So you have a requirement, and then you make something. So say your customer says, I need a widget, it's got to have A, B, and C. And the degree to which you make something that meets A, B, and C is quality. And a customer, or I mentioned key stakeholder or interested party, is anyone who has a say in what those requirements are. It's not necessarily the person who is paying you necessarily. There are other people who have input into those requirements. And then a product or service is the thing that encapsulates your part of the transaction. So the widget that you make or the service that you provide or the thing that you do that's on your end that you provide to your customer. That is what we're talking about when we mention product or service. And also the system part of a quality management system is the collective series of processes that affect those inherent characteristics. So if you are being asked to make a widget that has A, B, and C, everything that you do, excuse me, that affects A, B, and C, those are all different processes that affect those characteristics. All of those taken as a whole and looked at in the way that they interact and relate to each other and work together to provide that thing is called a system. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a system. Then I also wanted to mention the ISO standard makes reference to like the plan, do, check, act framework. You plan to do something, and then you do it, and you check how you did, and then you act on making improvements to it and making it continuously better. And also the process approach, which similar to the system, but just the way of thinking about getting from point A to point B in the context of a system. So those are just some definitions to kind of lay some groundwork and start building some of that common language before we start really getting into the meat of a quality management system. So let's look at some of the components. This is kind of a nice overview of how a quality management system works. And this is taken from the ISO 9001 framework. But the reason I use it is because it gives a nice visual way to compartmentalize and start to break apart some of the components of a quality management system so that you can actually start working on these different areas and engage with them, interact with them. So as you can see, first thing I want to point out is that it starts and ends with the customer. The customer is giving requirements and providing input into the process, and then the customer is also providing feedback on how those requirements have been met. And each of these numbers corresponds to a different section of the ISO 9001 standard, so don't worry about those. It's just more of a way to kind of organize and frame our thinking about it as we get into it. So we'll start with the central piece, the general requirements. This is kind of the hub that the whole quality management system wheel spins around. And a lot of it is captured in the dreaded D word, documentation. And the first question that always comes up with the documentation is how much? How much do I need? What do I have to write down? And the answer really is it depends. You have to write down what you need to control a process. And in some cases that process could be controlled. I'm going to get into processes and what controls them and stuff a little bit later. But in some cases that could just be a sign. In some cases that could be a verbal set of instructions. And in other cases you might need a full standard operating procedure or something. But just whatever you need to make sure that the process that is going to affect meeting your customers' requirements is controlled. When it comes to documentation too, those things that you do have written down, you need to ensure a consistent way those documents get updated and distributed. So whenever there's a change to a process, whether you're doing something new, or you found a way to do something better, or you found something that was an error and needs to be fixed, how do those documents get updated? And then how do those documents get out to where they need to be used? And how do the old versions get taken out of circulation so they're not used by accident? Also, as we're performing these different activities, we're going to probably generate some records. So a document or a procedure is something that gives instructions on how to do something or specifies the way something is going to be done, where a record is a snapshot in time that captures when something did happen. So records obviously can't be altered after they're made. So those records that are generated need to be stored in some way. That's going to be protected from somebody spilling coffee on them or them accidentally getting thrown in the recycling. And also in a way that's going to be accessible. So if you need to reference them afterwards, how are you going to find them and retrieve what you need? And when it comes to formats, are you going to have everything be printed out on paper or written out or kept electronically or through Google Docs or through, for my QMS and the Michigan Group Gap Network, it's all built through a wiki, a website. My suggestion there is just to keep it simple. Don't try to manage two separate systems where some things are printed out and some things are kept electronically, or you're constantly printing stuff out and then signing it and then scanning it back into the system. Just try to keep it as consistent and simple as possible. And then one of the main pieces of the documentation piece is the quality manual. I think my slide got cut off a little bit there. So the quality manual, houses a lot of central info. It's basically the trunk of the QMS tree that everything kind of branches off of. And it one of the main pieces of that, I'm going to pull up my own slides here just so I make sure I don't forget what I had written down. One of those pieces obviously is the quality policy, which is the mission statement of the QMS, so to speak. And that is just a simple statement that demonstrates your commitment to meeting your customers' requirements. It could talk a little bit about how you're going to operate your quality management system, those kind of things. It should be short, and it also should be communicated throughout the entire organization. Oh, there we go. Another thing that is really important to have in the quality manual is identifying who your customers are and what requirements do they have. Remember that quality is the degree to which your inherent characteristics of what you're providing to your customer meets your customer's requirements. So it's kind of hard to do that if you don't know who your customers are and what the requirements are. So identifying specifically who your customers are, who, not even just the people who are paying you to do something, but who also has a say in those requirements. Even if that's from a regulation standpoint, identifying who those are and what those requirements are. And then quality objectives are relatively short-term, measurable, actionable goals that are related to meeting those different requirements. So those are usually, 2 or 3 or 4 statements saying this is what we're going to be aiming for in the near term. We're going to review these often, and when we meet them, we're going to update them. And if we keep falling short of them, we're going to do the necessary corrective actions to ensure that we can meet them. Bottom line when it comes to documentation for me is make it usable. You can have all the documentation in the world. It's not going to do you any good if it's just sitting on a shelf collecting dust or sitting on a hard drive somewhere. It needs to be something that is efficient and easy to engage with, something that it would be hard not to engage with, something that is going to be usable for you in your day-to-day. There we go. So we'll start at the top. We'll start at the top of the quality management system cycle with management responsibility. Now, quality management can't just be a side hustle of the organization. That is a really good tweetable bullet point, just saying. So management commitment begins and ends the quality cycle. So the quality management has to be embedded throughout the entire organization, because it's just a part of what you do. You're providing something to your customer. And so it starts with management, and probably the most or the primary activity that is associated with this step is the management review. Beyond just management commitment, there's a management review, which is a formal review of the performance of the QMS. It happens usually annually, but can also happen quarterly or monthly, or however often you want to have it. But what that does is that looks at how the QMS is doing. Where are we on track to meet our quality objectives that we've set? And this looks at nonconformities and corrective actions. I'll get into those in a few slides later. Complaints, audit results, and all other kinds of different feedback that tells the management how the QMS is operating. And then it initiates plans for improvement. So it looks at how things are doing and says, here's what we need to do to either improve it or maybe even like shift direction. So management also ensures that adequate resources are provided for quality to be met. So it leads me into resource management, the next spoke on the QMS wheel. So when you talk about resource management, that's primarily the people that are working in the organization, and roles and responsibilities in the context of the processes that affect quality should be defined out. So when it comes to the things that you're doing to provide your product or service to your customer, who is responsible for each of these things, and who what responsibilities do they have, and then what is the necessary competency or training that each of these roles requires. So if you're a food hub and you have somebody working in the warehouse, those could be things like forklift operation or food safety training, instructions on inventory rotation, and allergen control, those kind of things. What are those things, specifying those out and making sure that the people that are operating in those roles have that necessary competency or training. So what does a person in this role need to know? And this training can happen externally or internally. It could happen through a webinar like this. It could happen at an outside training, or having a consultant come in, or it could just be on-the-job training as well. You could have your own instructions. And so beyond just the human resources, this also includes other infrastructure type things. This is more about like setting up that infrastructure that supports the processes that go into creating your product or service. So this would be your building or technology, or if you're a farm and one of your customer requirements is they want leafy greens from March through November, and you live in Ohio, you're probably going to need a hoop house. So that would be another piece of that resource management, because you're providing some infrastructure to help meet those customer requirements. So quick recap. We talked a little bit about the general requirements in the middle, and the documentation, and how everything kind of rotates around that. We talked at the top about management responsibility and how things get kicked off that way, and we talked about one of the first steps in that is providing adequate resources to actually do the work. Now, in the context of the plan, do, check, act cycle, we're still in that kind of planning stage. But now we're going to move into the do part of the cycle with product realization. So this is the meaty work of what you're doing in your business. So this is what you would think of When somebody asks you, what does your business do, this is probably what you would describe. So this is if you're a farm, this is the planting and harvesting and soil management and storing. If you're a food hub, this is the warehousing and transportation and all of that kind of stuff. So I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk about processes and control. So how are the processes that have an effect on quality controlled? So again, if you're a farm and you're being asked to provide leafy greens in March, what are the processes that could affect that? You know, your harvesting process could have an effect on meeting that requirement, because if you harvest it at the wrong time, you could have, if you harvest it too late, you're going to have a late order, that kind of stuff. Or if you're harvesting it and packing it in a way that your customer can't use, or makes it more of a hassle for them to use, that could have an effect on your quality. So how are those processes controlled? Think about the things that you do in-house, as well as any process that's outsourced to make your product or deliver your service. So if you outsource your transportation, that definitely has an effect on your product quality, because if they're parking a truck that's not a refrigerated truck in the sun for a few hours, it's going to definitely have an effect on your customer satisfaction. Or if you outsource your harvesting, that's also going to have an effect. It's a process that has an effect on the quality of your product or your service. So how are those also controlled? When I say control, I'm not meaning it has to be a very strict, tight type of control. It's more of a, how do you know that you're meeting your customers' requirements every step of the way throughout your value chain? Then also, what about suppliers? People who are supplying, plants to you, or if you're a food hub, people who are supplying the produce to you. If you're a food hub and you're delivering, cases of food to your customers, that goes all the way back to your suppliers too, making sure that when it comes in at the receiving dock, that it is meeting your requirements, because you are their customer. And then also, we've talked about what you're already doing, but what if you decide to do a new product or service? So how do you ensure that you've went through all this work to kind of build a QMS around what you're already doing? How do you ensure that if you're going to do something new, you're going to have that same cycle again? How do you going to ensure that you've accurately captured your customer requirements and that you can meet them, that you have adequately allocated resources to provide the necessary means to meet those customer requirements? There's you could have a whole process that kind of vets a new idea into your business. And then, as with everything, document as much of this as you need to, or if you're required to. If you're bound by an organic standard or a food safety standard, there might not be as much leeway with the documentation. So that's the actual doing part of things. And then the checking again. Jeff, if you could do whatever you did last time to bring that back up, that would be great. So again, this is once we've done that, once we've delivered our product or service to our customer, now it's how do we do and how are we doing? This is measuring and making sure that we've met those customer requirements. And if we haven't, well, why not? So one thing to do is you could periodically audit your system to identify any shortcomings. That's just auditing yourself and your own business. Typically, it's best to have somebody who is not directly responsible for those activities do the auditing. So there's a little bit of, cool, thank you, Jeff. So there's a little bit of fresh eyes on it and a little bit of objectivity. So that's one way to kind of measure the performance of the QMS. And also, when a product doesn't meet requirements, if it's non-conforming, how is it controlled and kept from going out the door? So say that you order from a farmer, you wanted Roma tomatoes, and they deliver cherry tomatoes. So you want to catch that at the receiving dock, not when it's a complaint from a customer. Make sure that when product is not meeting requirements, that it is caught in quarantine and resolved before it gets to your customer. And when those issues do come up, or if you identify opportunities for improvement, it kind of goes through the same process. How are those things resolved? And I wanted to define out a couple different terms because they kind of get interspersed a little bit. So a correction would be you've fixed the problem. So in that tomato example, if you send the tomatoes back to the farmer and get the correct ones back, that's a correction. You fixed the problem. A corrective action is you fix the cause of the problem. So you dive a little bit deeper into the issue and say, okay, well, the issue here was that my ordering process, just said tomatoes. And so the farmer assumed that I said cherry tomatoes, so we sent those. So it's a communications issue. So you fix the cause of the problem and you fix that communications problem. And then preventive action is you fix the potential cause of similar problems before they could become problems. And this would be, okay, well, if there's a communications problem in my ordering of vegetables, maybe there's a communications problem in my ordering of other things. So I would look into those and make sure that everything's on the up and up before it becomes a problem. That's a preventive action. So the results of all these activities then become inputs into the management review, and the process starts all over again. So you're checking your system and making sure that you are meeting customer requirements and seeing how well you're meeting customer requirements, and those all get fed right back into management review, which then looks at those, makes a plan to act on any improvements or resolving issues, allocates resources, and it goes all the way back around again. So that's kind of the quality management system cycle in a little bit closer up. I do want to mention a little bit on risk, because that is a major part of quality management systems in general, but also definitely a part of the measurement, analysis, and improvement side of things. So when I say risk means the effect of uncertainty on an outcome. So you want a certain outcome, and the effect of uncertainty, of uncontrol, I guess would be another way to say it, is what we would call risk. So when I'm talking about controlling a process in that product realization phase, this is kind of what I'm getting at, is that how much uncertainty are you okay with, and so on. So risk management is threaded throughout QMS activities, primarily as preventive action. You're trying to identify these issues before they happen. And it also factors into the level of documentation you need. So when I'm talking about controlling a process, if it's a low risk where, so say I'm in a warehouse, and in a cooler, it doesn't really matter where, how things are stored, I guess. As long as inventory is being properly rotated, it's at the right temperature, and things are labeled, that is the level of uncertainty that I'm comfortable with. But if I introduce, say, an allergen into that scenario, now it matters actually a lot more where things are located in the cooler. So I would maybe need a little bit more documentation, a little bit more labeling, a little bit more thought out shelving, I guess. So the level of risk kind of definitely factors into the level of documentation or even infrastructure that you might need. So one thing that I do in thinking about this and how to assess risk in a consistent way is that for each critical process, I think, what is the severity of it going wrong? What is the severity of if this process breaks down, or what are the outer parameters of that uncertainty? And what is the probability of that happening? And what detection methods do I have in place to catch it if it does go wrong? And one thing that I actually do in my system is I actually give each of these numerical value. And then I have a threshold for the product of those values. And if there's above a certain level, I have to do something to bring it down, either add a detection method or do something else. So in the allergen case, the severity is pretty high, even if the probability is pretty low. And it could go either way too, where, if something like with an allergen, if the severity is pretty high, the probability could still be low, but you still want to take some action on it. And vice versa, if the severity might be low, say that in the original example where my cooler is a bit disorganized, but there's no allergens in there, so the severity of it, getting, things being mixed up is low, but the probability is pretty high because there's no control over it, so everything's just kind of a mess. So even though the severity is low, I would still want to take some action on it because it's still going to be affecting my worker time, and there could be some spoilage issues and all the other kinds of things. So I think that analogy started to break down a little bit, but I hope you get trying to get what I'm saying here with how you can look at consistently, objectively analyzing risk. So let's take a breath and talk through a couple different implementation scenarios. And so if we're on a farm, how would this look if I implemented a QMS on a farm? So I would start, say I have just a regular farm. I'm growing leafy greens. I have a handful of different customers, and so one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to start writing some of these things down. I might write a quality policy and say, here's what we're going to do as far as quality. Bob's farm is committed to quality and continuously improving the satisfaction of our customers, something like that. And then I'm going to identify who my customers are. Say, okay, I have some direct sales. I have a handful of grocery stores that I'm selling to. I'm selling to a wholesaler. These are my customers. These are who they are. These are their requirements. Here's what they're asking me to do. They want it to be organic. They want it to be fresh. They want it to be free of microbial contamination, that kind of stuff. So I start collecting all these things. Then I'll set out some quality objectives and say, okay, I'm going to have less than 5 late shipments this year. I'm going to have 80% positive feedback on my customer survey, or things like that. I start writing out those, start defining some targets to be aiming at for this next year. And then I'll take it from a management responsibility standpoint. I will maybe have like an initial management review to kind of look at how this is going to be taking shape and how this QMS is going to look when it's done. I'll start thinking about what resources I'm going to need to allocate. I'm going to start by looking at any issues that I might have had in the past, that whether they're written down or not. I start kind of thinking through those types of things. And the biggest thing is that the management from the top down is saying, we're committed to doing this. We're committed to working this into the fabric of our business. Then I'm going to start defining out different roles and responsibilities. I'm going to say, hey, my harvest crew, this is what they're responsible for. This is what they need to know. They need to be trained to this food safety standard. They need to be trained on bloodborne pathogen training, because they're working with knives. They need to be trained on a handful of other different things. And then we're also going to have Bob himself come in and do a quick brief history of the farm and kind of what are some of the core principles of this farm and how we operate. And we're going to document all those out. And then I'm going to say my food safety manager is required, is responsible for these things and has to have these core competencies, and so on and so forth, all down the line for all of these people who are responsible for things that affect my product's quality, that affects the quality of these leafy greens that I'm giving to my customers. And then also when it comes to other customer requirements too, I'm going to work in my organic requirements as well. So that's another requirement, even though, obviously that's not, the organic standard isn't paying me for anything, but it still has an input onto what those requirements are because my customers are asking for it. And then we're gonna do the farming. We're gonna do the soil management, and we're gonna define out controls for the different processes that could affect those things. So in my, we're only going to be using properly composted compost, animal manure. We're going to be meeting all of our organic growing practices. We're going to be doing things in a food safe way. And so to the degree that I need to write those things out, they're going to be written out. Maybe I'll have them in a couple binders in different working areas. I outsource my transportation to my wholesalers. They come and pick it up. So I'm going to ask for some assurance from them that they're going to keep it at the proper temperature, that they're going to be delivering it on time, those kind of things, and handling it properly, warehousing it properly if need be. So we're going to write out all those things to the degree that we need to. And then we're just going to do the work. And then lastly, we're going to check how we did. That could be through a customer satisfaction survey. We're going to keep a log of anytime there's a nonconformity, anytime, say, that product is packed incorrectly, we're going to write it down. Once a year, I'm going to have somebody come in and just do a walkthrough, like an audit, and tell me areas that could use some improvement, things like that. And then we're going to take all of those things, any customer complaints that we have, any other corrective actions that we need to do or have already done this year. We'll take all of that information and bundle it up and look it over again at management review, and start the process all over again and see, okay, what do we need to be working on this next year, and how did we do this last year, and what can we improve on, and maybe next year we're going to start growing some tomatoes too, because customers keep asking for us. Let's talk about what we need to do to control those processes, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of how it works on a farm. And say in a food hub, another example, very similar things. I have, customers that are asking for, they're going to have requirements like we want locally sourced tomatoes. We want to know that it's all from within a 100-mile radius. So there's a customer requirement. So we're going to feed that into our documentation. Identifying our customers again, and writing up our quality policy. We're going to make sure that it's communicated from top management all the way down, that it's embedded throughout the entire organization, that these are our customers, these are the requirements, here's how we're going to be doing things. We're going to allocate resources properly. Maybe we're going to need a warehouse and a cooler and a forklift and all these other things. We're going to define out maybe a little bit more complicated roles and responsibilities. We might actually have like a quality manager on staff that handles all of this. We might, we have warehouse personnel, we'll have custodial, we'll have, office people, all that stuff, drivers. So for all those people, we're going to list out what their roles are, what their responsibilities are, and what competencies and training they might need, and allocating the resources and building that infrastructure to kind of make the actual doing stuff happen. And again, we're going to be rotating inventory, segregating allergens, checking for spoilage, delivering on time, all of these processes that have an impact on those customer requirements. What degree do we need to control them? That's up to the business. And then again, we're going to check and see how we did at the end of the year. Any safety incidents or any non-conforming products or customer complaints or anything like that. All of that gets factored in, brought together into a management review, and the cycle continues. So here's a screenshot from my QMS with the Michigan Group Gap Network. And like I said, this is all based out of a wiki in Google Sites. Although I'm actually going to migrate into something else this next year. But here's a snapshot of our quality manual. One of the things I always like to include too is like a purpose. What is this document for, and a scope? What are the boundaries of this document? Who does it apply to? Who's responsible for updating it? You can see our quality policy there. If you can't read it, it says the Michigan Group Gap Network is helping build a resilient, socially just food system through food safety collaboration, utilizing a dynamic approach to quality systems and compliance. And then we've listed out a few quality objectives. They're specific and measurable, but they're also not like too specific. So we've said it's a successful group gap certification of all participating members in our program. New and or increased market opportunities for participating members. And that's actually one for the last couple of years that we haven't really been hitting. So we're placing more emphasis on it now this year and trying to push that a little bit more. Then also a clear plan for implementation for groups wishing to follow. So you can see also up on the top left how I have all of my other procedures listed out. So there's references, cross-references throughout the documents, but this is all of the documentation for my quality management system. And some things I do have in separate files, but they're linked through a Google Drive folder in this, so it's all in one place. And I've done everything electronically because our network is statewide and not in one physical location. And then a little bit further down on that, I go into who our customers are. I actually define out the requirements in a different document, but our customers are farmers and members and also wholesale buyers, and I also list out additional interested parties, people who are have a say in what our requirements are, like the USDA from a regulatory standpoint, consumers as the final end users, and other food hubs and groups. So then I list out where those other customer inputs are. Then I get into management review and what that's like, and you can see where I start getting into where I'm defining out those different roles, the responsibilities, the core competencies they need to have, and what documentation I have to have on hand to prove that they meet those core competencies, and then who actually fulfills those roles. So that's kind of what my QMS looks like in action. Yours could look totally different. They're meant to be very adaptable to your scenario. So, in summary, the quality management systems can be a valuable tool for meeting your customers' requirements, managing risk, and continuously improving. And I think it's important to keep looking at this as a tool, or I also like to say a technology, rather than a standard or requirement you have to meet. It's more of something that's supposed to be leveraged by you to meet a goal. They don't need to be complex or heavily documented. Again, focus on that usability and functionality and efficiency too, I'd also say. And then whether or not you choose to implement a full QMS, applying risk-based and systems thinking throughout your organization will yield major improvements. I guarantee it. So I hope this was informative and helpful for you, and I hope your brains aren't exploding because it's a lot of information. But we can go into some time for some questions and answers. Lindsey might chime in a little bit too with her experiences, and I also have my contact info down there too. If you think of a question afterwards, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to talk further about quality management systems. So
yeah, let me introduce Lindsey. Lindsey Gilmore is a food systems consultant currently focused on gap food safety education. She co-managed a USDA group gap pilot in Pennsylvania, supporting over 100 Amish farmers through certification. She also works with individual farmers and orchardists, urban farmers, co-ops, food hubs, helping them develop food safety program that best meets their needs. She's used QMS to make farm food safety plans and group gap plans, so has another perspective. And particularly sort of note is her work with folks who don't use technology. So welcome, Lindsey, also to the conversation.
Hello.
It seems that creating a quality management system is a little bit science and a lot of art. What I mean by that is that finding the right level of detail and prescriptiveness while maintaining enough flexibility to prepare for things that just can't be planned for, both at a sort of a food hub off the farm level, and maybe even especially at the on the farm level.
Yeah, I would also say too that almost everyone always starts off with too much documentation. Just because you just don't know. So that's why one of the things I say about it being usable is that once you build it out and then realize that you have way too much, that it's not too cumbersome to pare down and make lighter.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful for people to realize that a food safety plan is a type of quality management system. So it might look a little different because you're having to comply with a food safety standard, but it is a kind of quality management system. So if you've already got one of those, then you're already managing a quality management system. This is just because if you want to comply with USDA group gap, there's a certain way, or there's certain things you need to include in your QMS for group gap, and it looks a little different, but the principles are the same. You have a quality policy, or a food safety policy in this case, and you have quality objectives, which would be the objectives you have to keep your food safe. And I think in a food safety plan, it's really focused on risk and risk assessment and how you mitigate risk. And in a quality management system, it's how you achieve the quality objectives that you've set out for yourself. That helps. That might just make it more confusing.
No, that's great.
I, in the absence of other questions, I had some questions that I thought we could discuss. So you had talked about just customers is actually one of the most difficult things to get your head around with the QMS, because they're not necessarily the people that buy your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it might help to talk about, I could say who the customers, I think the customers that I have and the QMSs that I've written are similar to Phil's, because mostly I've copied what Phil does. But it really, the person that buys the food is really just one of your customers. So the key thing to keep in mind is that if you have a food hub or a food co-op, the members are also considered customers within the quality management system. And so their complaints and their requirements are just as important as the complaints and requirements and so on of the people that buy the food from you, from your food hub or from your co-op. Mm-hmm. And then I've got USDA in there as a customer, but and Phil refers to them as interested parties. It can be either way. I feel like their requirements are very, you are actually fulfilling their requirements in the QMS, so it seems like a pretty strong relationship to me. But it's up to you how you describe it.
Yeah, that was language that I took from the most recent revision of ISO 9001. Where it's like they're not any less in terms of the overall customer base, but it's just a different way to kind of organize it and a different way to think about it.
Right. Okay, I'll add that to my brain. You've actually read the latest requirements. That's wonderful.
I haven't read it. That was what
Oh.
marketing was talking about last time we met.
Okay, good. And then just to reinforce the difference between documents and records, which is something that people tend to get confused. As you said, Phil, the document is how it is done, and records are when and by whom it was done. And documents can be altered, but you have to control the documents to make sure you have the most recent one in active use, as Phil said. And then records cannot be altered, although if for some reason there's a mistake, you just have a process for altering it where somebody is signing and dating it, kind of like a check that has a mistake written on it. But typically you don't, and you want to keep documents and records separate in your brain. Documentation is both of those things, but documents and records are two different things. I have a little bit, I wish I had thought of doing this ahead of time. I could have shown you a different QMS, but I have a little bit of a different way of describing the different parts of the QMS. Just pull up my Dropbox. So within the QMS files, I have contracts and lists. And list would be all of the people in the co-op or all of the farmers in the food hub. Contracts would be things like the contract with your internal auditor, the membership contract that you have with everyone in the co-op or the food hub. Procedures are all the things that, it's the how we do things. So the quality manual and the procedure for controlling documents and controlling records and all those sorts of things, the internal audits. And then forms or templates, Phil has those as downloads because you click on that and you download it, so it makes sense. But when obviously with Amish, I can't call it a download, so I just call it forms and templates. And so with the Amish, there would be 3 different binders with different things in them, or 2 different binders: the procedures, contracts and lists, and then all of the forms templates would be in a separate binder instead of a folder on your desktop.
Now we're this is really intended to be an introduction. It's not expected that you will now go be able to make a quality management system all by yourself by attending this single webinar. Is that true?
Very true.
But hearing the terms and understanding their flexibility, quality management systems are very, very flexible and approachable once you master the terminology and the sort of, I would even say, a mindset that goes along with them. So it's a super useful tool, but there's a learning curve.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I came into this clueless about what a QMS was and did, and the same thing with food safety, coming into the world of good agricultural practices and food safety audits. I was brand new to that as well, and it just takes time to get used to the language and the definitions of things, and you have to be somewhat patient with yourself and make as much use of other people who have done it already as you can.
Yeah, and here are 2 people who have done it. So so it's anyway. In the post-webinar survey, there is, I believe, a spot for you to say, "Hey, I would love one or both of these presenters to contact me for some consulting work." So that is a possibility. If anyone has any other questions, please type them in. Lindsey, Phil, any more questions for each other?
I don't have any, no.
Actually, I have a question for you, Phil. Mainly because this is what I've been telling people, and I want to check that I'm saying the right thing. So We have the annual management review that's part of the QMS. What I tell people, oftentimes management review just doesn't happen once in the year. It happens throughout the year. And they're having, certainly the same with product realization. You get new customer requirements or new food safety requirements or other things going on throughout the year, and you want to keep track of those. I'm thinking the same thing with management review. You want to keep a record, keep notes of those casual conversations that you have throughout the year that actually influence how everything is being done, how the processes are carried out.
Mm-hmm.
And that you can just file all of that with your annual review. You may want to review it again with in your formal annual management review meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you don't keep those notes, you won't remember half of it.
Right. Yeah, one thing that I do too is I actually set up the agenda for the management review, ahead of time. And, so it's not just, just in there trying to remember everything in the meeting. You're actually thinking that through ahead of time and then walking through it. So yeah, all that could just be compiled into one location, where they do that, once or twice a year.
Right.
Or quarterly or whatever. You go over it.
Yeah, some people automatically keep notes and others just think, well, that's done and I can forget about it. But when it comes to quality management and food safety, you have to keep documentation. Otherwise, no one will ever know it happened except you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's my final word.
Good. Well, there is, as part of the Alba Western SARE grant, there is one-on-one technical assistance provided. So there's an email address here, or in the post-webinar survey, you can just say, "Hey, I'm interested in that," and we'll let you know. So thank you both to Phil and to Lindsey. Another whirlwind of information, and we did record this. So if you missed something and you want to review, no problem. We can go to ngfn.org/webinars and review it. Or if you'd like to share this webinar with a colleague, please feel free to direct them to NGFN. NGFN is National Good Food Network. .org/webinars. These are the 5 sessions here. You can see that we've just completed developing a quality management system. The final one on June 6th is all about geeking out about staying clean. So we will send reminders, but if you are interested in this webinar, make sure you schedule it in block it off in your calendar, starting at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, noon 30 Eastern time, going for about an hour and a half. Also, if you see any of these on this list that you wish that you'd attended, don't forget, we have recorded all of them. NGFN, there's the website right there, ngfn.org/webinars. And we have webinars on all sorts of topics. On the left-hand navigation on our website, we have these categorized by topic. So you can see our other food safety webinars or other webinars about food systems, value chains, food hubs, all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, really, we have something like 75 webinars, so it's, lots of content there. All right, the National Good Food Network is we have our website, but also Twitter, YouTube. You can email us at contact@ngfn.org. Do remember to fill out that post-webinar survey. Thank you all for your time today, and we'll see you on June 6th. Bye-bye.